of Indigenous people who have taken care of this land long before other nation groups came. We acknowledge that the work of OCASI takes place on traditional Indigenous territories of the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit. This territory is part of the Dish with One Spoon Treaty, which is an agreement between the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the allied nations to care and share the resources around the Great Lakes. This territory is also covered by the Upper Canada Treaties. Today, see Takaranto, the traditional Mohawk name of this area called Toronto, meaning trees in the water, and its surrounding areas are still home to Indigenous people, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to meet, work, and play on this territory as settlers. This recognition of the contributions and historic importance of Indigenous people must also be clearly and overtly connected to our collective commitment to make the promise and the challenge of truth and reconciliation real in our communities. As you know, today's session focuses on dismantling systemic racism and discrimination at your organizations. It's important to highlight that this must be done simultaneously with decolonizing your organization and dismantling anti-Indigenous racism within your organizations. We hope that the tools that OCASI creates and shares with the immigrant and refugee serving sector are just the first steps in our sector being truly equitable and eventually moving beyond anti-racism to advocating for and seeking justice for those who are marginalized and oppressed, whether it's in Canada or around the world. All right, so with that, I will introduce this series for those of you who are attending these series for the first time. This webinar and conversation series by OCASI is for the immigrant and refugee serving sector. It's to move from intention to action in understanding what is systemic racism, addressing racial discrimination, and building towards racial equity in the sector and beyond. This is part 3 of the series called Racial Equity from Intention to Action. And there will be 5 more great webinars that OCASI has planned for you between January to March. We do have a set of amazing panelists and speakers today, so I will introduce them briefly, and then we will go into a series of questions for the panelists after a presentation by one of our speakers. So we have Asha Edwin. Asha is an intersectional and interdisciplinary researcher, an anti-racism and equity consultant and facilitator, and yoga and wellness practitioner. Asha works with various community partners and organizations exploring topics related to wellness, well-being, movement, and sport, culture, education, community engagement, and development and workplace change. Deborah Robertson has worked in the immigration serving sector since immigrating from London, England, almost 2 decades ago. After lived experience as a client, volunteer, and settlement service program coordinator, Deborah currently serves as the executive director of the North Bay and District Multicultural Center and its sister office, the Timmins and District Multicultural Center. And finally, Shaniza Nasir Ali is the executive director for the For Youth Initiative. Shaniza oversees the vision, strategy, and direction of the organization. Previously, Shaniza served as FYIs in roles such as fundraising, community engagement, mentorship of young community leaders. She has a deep appreciation of the York Southwestern and Oakwood Vaughan communities on the needs of their youth. Shaniza is also a known advocate for the creation of opportunities that allow young people to realize their potential, and more importantly, those that provide the mentorship and resources to combat the disproportionate inequity that Black, racialized, and newcomer youth face. All right, so before I go on and turn it over to Asha, I know we do have a set of polls for the audience. So on your screen, you will see 2 polls pop up. The first poll will ask you to rate your understanding of anti-racism and anti-oppression. So you will have 4 options there: no understanding, some understanding, good understanding, and advanced understanding. So if I can get a thumbs up when that's up, that would be great. There we go. So once you've answered that question, you can submit that poll. We do have a second poll. Once you finish that question, the second poll will ask you, does your organization have an anti-racism, anti-oppression framework? And the three options are yes, no, or not sure. So that will pop up as soon as the first poll is finished on your screen. Please select your answer and submit it. There we go. That's the second poll. So there's one person who's not seeing the poll on their screen. Can someone help them out, please? So it should be up and you should complete the poll soon. Once everybody's completed the poll, we should have the results of the poll. Great. All right, so those were the two polls. If you didn't get a poll, maybe you can put if you can direct message tech support and let them know. Or if you want to even let tech support know the answer to your question, if you feel comfortable, you can also participate that way. So I will now pass it over to Asha, who will be presenting the toolkit that OCASI has created to walk us through some of its various pieces and components.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much, Samia, for the introduction. I do also want to add an important affiliation recently that I'm a student and research assistant with the Ideas Research Lab, and that is under the direction of Dr. Janelle Joseph. And so today, I will quickly go over a brief overview of the ARAO kit. Previously, we have done some webinar series with full explorations or details of the kit, but today, as folks move into introduction and implementation, I've designed this to support the discussion today, but also to help folks move this into action or support in moving this into action with a understanding of how the kit works and some of the things to consider as we introduce or implement the kit. So the presentation overview will include the process of development, how the ARAO kit came to be. We'll look at sort of the history and what it builds on briefly. We'll go into the ARAO policy kit, so the components of the kit for reference. Using and referencing the kit, I will provide a quick example of how you can reference the kit and/or if you're adopting or adapting the ways in which you can use it or integrate it into other existing policies, and supporting introduction and implementation, some considerations that organizations can take or keep in mind. So the process of development, the history, the revision of the ARAO policy, and the creation of the kit. This is a long-term effort that builds on the work and recommendations from an environmental assessment that we conducted in 2021. So it's a sectoral collaborative effort and collective visioning really to reimagine how ARAO is confronted organizationally and across the sector. It really aims to support organizations in confronting and addressing racism, as I mentioned, and it was deeply informed by the work of 14 members on an advisory panel, who to this day I owe immense gratitude for their contributions as well as revisions, as well as the support of the board in different capacities and other folks in the sector, across the sector actually, who have contributed to the final documents. It was comprised of, the development, what had happened is a policy review. Then we developed, not a new policy, we revised it. And then we developed the kit as part of supporting organizations introduce or implement the kit. So the kit, which is available on OCASI's website, includes an updated ARAO policy from December 2023. We've also included an ARAO overview document. And this document really explains what ARAO is, some of the history and meaning behind the different parts of the ARAO policy, as well as what it can mean in the organization. We also developed an implementation guide to support organizations in the introduction, as well as a glossary of terms, which is not final, but something that we can work on, we can add to over time. Each resource was designed or aims to support organizations in supplementing other resources as part of the kit or supplementing current internal or external practices or policies. So for example, as we'll get into using and referencing the kit, number 2, so the overview supports number 3, the implementation guide, and vice versa. So there's a lot of consistency across the kit, hoping to help and support consistency across organizations with introduction and implementation processes. So if you have, for example, several policies and are wondering where the policy fits in, it might be helpful to the organization to consider how it aligns with current policies by referencing the 4 pillars, which we identified and I'll get into, and the policy areas that are numbered, which have been identified that you can reference with the policy and or other internal policies. So using and referencing the kit, these are direct screenshots from the kit. And this is a way, if I can briefly describe or demonstrate how the kit can be used, depending on where you are in your organization. I'm hoping that this will be maybe insightful or helpful for organizations. So the first on the left, the image, the policy pillars considerations for adaptation or adoption, they came from the ARAO overview document. And on the right, these are the pillars that you can align with policy objectives, which came for considerations for introduction from the implementation guide. So depending on where you are in your journey, for example, if you, for example, are adopting the policy, you would update the information directly into the document based on your organization's information. Or if you already have a policy, we have designed it to align easily with the ARA policy. So looking at the screenshots, we have aimed to create consistency. And one of those examples is using where in the sections of the policy, we have identified them with the policy pillars, as well as the objectives. And you can see that through like 1.1, 2.1, 2.2, which will align consistently with each document. If, for example, you want to align your mission, vision, and values, beliefs, or aims, depending on where you are in the organization, you would align that with 1.1 of the policy. Subsequently, if you wanted to organize or align your guiding principles, if you were adapting the policy, you would align it with the different sections in section 2 of the policy. In that way, we tried in many ways to support organizations who don't have any policies or who are very new to the process, and maybe organizations who are further or more advanced in their ARAO journey to align the document or the policy with current policies. In that you may unearth new things, and or you may have seen where you are in the journey or where we can improve or vice versa. So the reciprocal exchange between what exists with OCASI and currently what's happening in the organization, and maybe a way to offer back other advice or opportunities for other organizations to support them in their ARAO journey. In either case, whether you're adapting or adopting, the policy would stand alone. And or if you're adapting, it would be supported by your other policies in the organization. And a nice rule I like to go by is one is better than none and two is better than one. So the more policies you have, the more encompassing it has to address anti-racism or anti-oppression, other forms of oppression, marginalization, or experiences within the organization. It creates a nice consistency and an enveloping commitment to ARAO in your organization and across the sector. And if I'm moving too quickly, this will be recorded so you can reference back, and I'm always happy to answer any questions toward the end. We have set aside 10 minutes for this presentation, which I forgot to mention. So I do want to be mindful of that. The last slide that we'll come to is supporting introduction and implementation in the organization. And these are a few key things that have come up in conversation, as well as other areas that would result if you were potentially doing the work, and that I've also seen in the field. So creating shared culture and meaning with the organization is important. Obviously, organizational values, mission, and visions is integral and essential, really, and central to this process and how that is shared. Information is power. And I like to say that because it does really impact how this is communicated, how this is shared, and how people feel and respond to ARAO, depending on where the organization is, current conversations within the organization, current conversations socially, culturally, and globally. Communication and messaging are important, and this is something we learn through the process. Engage various levels of management and device representation. And this is something we try to demonstrate as well through our process of developing the kit. Integration of processes and practices in the organization. What is the consistency that exists? How are we making it accessible to individuals? Again, going back to information number 3 and number 4, communication, how are we sharing that message across our organizations? Strengths, opportunities, and tools. Some folks like to look at it as SWOT. I like to say move into sort of this more innovative, progressive, and reimaginative language that allows us to really think about how we are integrating ARAO. And rather than maybe naming something as negative or wrong, thinking about the positives and areas of improvement so that we can move forward and seek or ask for the tools that we need. We want to ask ourselves, where does information live? Are there opportunities for staff to ask questions? How do we align with current and future concerns internally and externally? And naming really what we're doing well, what opportunities do we have to address any challenges that may arise? And of course, how can we collaborate with other organizations in the sector to continue this work? And I do want to say thank you, merci. But I do want to really point to this section, using and referencing the ARAO kit, as something, as we move forward in this conversation, as something that will be helpful for organizations to reference as they move forward in their ARAO journey. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Asha, for that presentation. It's very helpful for many of us that have not been introduced to the toolkit yet. And I'm sure folks have a lot of questions about the implementation of the toolkit. And so we do have 2 speakers, panelists today, who are in the process of implementing the toolkit. And we do want to hear from them in terms of their experience, because it's one thing to have a toolkit and to kind of plan your process of implementation, but it's another, and it's equally as valuable to hear from folks that are already going through that process so that you can learn from their process and their actions. So I'm going to turn it over to Deborah and Shaniza with a set of questions. So, Shaniza, if you don't mind, I will start with you in terms of the first question. So, in terms of the toolkit that Asha just presented, what drew you and perhaps your organization to using the ARAO framework?
Thank you, Samia. So what drew FYI is that we were founded on the principle of ending inequity, and yet we were in a place where we needed to produce policies that were at pace with our practices. We had grown so quickly, and we had these very outdated policies that didn't reflect what our staff were looking for. And then I would also say the increased expectations of funders in terms of anti-racism, anti-oppression policies, all rightfully so, but the resources and the time and even the guidance to do that, I was sort of lost as to how to do that effectively. And then also I would say that I had conducted an equity audit as an organization so that we could gather some really good feedback to start this work. And then when this opportunity came up, I felt like it was the right next step to guide myself and my team because I was really looking for direction.
Great, thank you so much. And thank you for mentioning that for a lot of our organizations that are built on the foundation of anti-racism, we often overlook it in terms of policy, right? And we say, so even for CASA, we're a social justice organization, our work is anti-racism, but it's equally as important to kind of develop these policies that Asha spoke about. Deborah, I'm going to turn it over to you in terms of what drew you to the ARAO framework.
Thanks, Samia. So just for context, we're a smaller organisation, Settlement Centre, and we're based in Northern Ontario. And while we do have a robust set of HR policies, which does include anti-violence, anti-harassment, we didn't have anything that spoke specifically to anti-racism and anti-oppression. And we just wanted to solidify and respond to conversations that were already happening within the organisation. But we were recognising an increasing need to define our position as an agency, both internally and externally. We wanted to ensure our organizational structures aligned, so our strategic planning, our vision, our mission, our values, and our HR policies. And the project seemed like an ideal opportunity to do that, to sort of start what previously had seemed like very daunting work.
Great. Thank you for sharing that experience in terms of starting from scratch from an organization that didn't have that policy to begin with. So, in terms of your implementation journey, what did you find the most useful about adapting the kit to your organization in your organizational context? So, maybe I'll start with Deborah this time and then move on to Shaniza.
So I think the only thing that I really knew when I started this was that I didn't know enough. So the first thing we did was to strike an internal subcommittee that could help guide this work, that was representative of the staff we have and the clients that we serve. And the next thing we decided to do was hire a consultant. So we did recognize the need for some external support who could help guide the process. The first thing we did was conduct an organizational assessment. So that really helped place us where we were in the eyes of our staff and board. We had a great response, but it certainly solidified the need for this work and a policy like this. I think we were very lucky in that we didn't have a lot of internal pushback or low engagement. But I think that in the instances where we did, we had to really take a critical look at why. So why aren't people responding? Is it that they have faced discrimination in the past? Is it that they feel like they're afraid to say the wrong thing? Is it that we haven't communicated the need for this work and this policy? So we also had to recognize everyone is at very different stages of the journey. And when we came to looking at the policy and its implementation, we realized how important language was, to keep the language very clear, very understandable, and to take many moments to pause and make sure that everybody had a similar and consistent understanding of what was in the policy and how it might be implemented.
So I'm just going to follow up on a couple of things that you mentioned, Deborah, in terms of your engagement with the consultant. You mentioned you engaged a consultant. How was your experience there? And I know you mentioned that there was minimal internal pushback, but how was your board engagement? Was your board, happy and took a positive outlook on this?
The consultant was excellent and really helped take some of that work out of organizing meetings, creating minutes, setting structure to the meetings, keeping us moving forward, keeping momentum. All those kinds of things were incredibly helpful. And we were lucky to have through this project the opportunity to do that. In terms of board engagement, I think what it did was really pinpoint the need for a vision, mission, and value statements, which while they were buried deep in some historical documents and they weren't really being used. And so to present it to the board as really a chance to solidify some of the work that we've already done or already doing, that their engagement was crucial for a top-down approach, and that we needed to do this work anyway, and that we were going to be aligning it with this opportunity to work with AREO policy. I mean, fortunately, I do have a very engaged board, and I'm very lucky to have that. But I think to lay it out at the beginning, you don't have to have like the details of it, but just kind of bring them in terms of this is work that's happening, this is an opportunity we have, and it's going to benefit the organization in these ways. And your input will be needed at this juncture, in this juncture, in this juncture. And for us, it was really engaging them around a vision, mission, and values creation, which is ongoing, but kind of orientated the work within their role.
Great, thank you for sharing that and how you weaved in kind of your strategic planning and involvement of the board. So that was really great to hear. Shaniza, what did you find more useful in terms of adapting the toolkit to your organization?
We also, well, so I guess when I started, my first thing, even when we actually submitted the expression of interest, was that I felt that I knew that it was going to be important for this to be a very, I wanted this approach to start with the board and at the same time start with our staff, and so really get that input and kind of meet them, somewhere in the middle. I really didn't feel like I was going to get very different perspectives because we the identities, I would say, of our board and our staff are reflective of the communities that we serve. So although they have different maybe level of experience and different stages in life, I did feel like their interactions with policies like this, knowing the importance of them, would be somewhat similar. And so the first thing I did was to select or to approach kind of a board sponsor, so someone who actually works in the sector and has a deep understanding. And I've noticed would bring me resources and would share and would sort of speak up about things that she felt would be very helpful to help educate the board and to provide training. And so that was really great because then I had someone who could help lead the work with the board and give me feedback and be a sounding board. At the same time, they were also they were available and then not, because then they were working on their PhD and working on their thesis, et cetera. So they kind of had to step back for a bit. And then what I did do was engage a consultant also, because this consultant was engaged to support us with our strategic planning process. What we ended up needing to add, or what I realized with the feedback that I'd heard, was that I had so many new staff. And just for reference, because we're a youth organization, we're very much youth-led, youth-driven, and the vast majority of our staff are under 30. And so many times we are working with those who were just coming out of school, and they're coming out of social work, they may be coming out of social justice education. And so the expectations of their employer, it was a bit challenging at times, because in some ways it was hard to get feedback, because I think to some degree, young people graduating and entering the workforce at that time, their expectation is that your employer is just going to, they have to be the one to lead and tell you, right? And so but we wanted this to obviously be an engaging process with their input and feedback. So it was a bit challenging at first, and I did have to work with my consultant to say, let's bring everybody in person, the surveys, the onlines, all the things that we're trying to do, the online, the virtual sessions, the things that we're trying to do to make this efficient are not getting us the results. So we actually had to put a bit more time, and I had asked them to help me lead um, in-person workshops, breaking into small groups, etc. And that actually really, really allowed us to give our team the freedom and the comfort, I think, to they actually pinpointed, what would they like to achieve, by when, and how would we measure success? And so that was really fantastic, because then we were able to take their goals and build them into our operational plans and incorporate them in our strategic plan. So a consultant was very helpful. A board sponsor definitely is helpful, and I think will be more helpful as we continue with the process. And I think knowing your team and knowing how to engage them, because we just had sort of like the same things being said, and I think they were tired of being consulted. I think this is something you have to be mindful of. They were tired of giving me feedback for the equity audit, feedback for our strategic plan, and even though there were different things I was looking for, I was getting the same answer. So it was like, okay, it's very clear what the priorities are. So I think that in-person small group engagement allows individuals to speak out a little bit more. Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that, Shaniza. And I think especially the perspective of working with young people, especially those that have spent years getting an education in social justice, when they come into the work field, they want to change the world, right? And so these kind of processes, it takes time for them to understand how to process and work through them. So the next question, so we talked about what worked, and I know both of you touched a little bit on some of your challenges, but if you can highlight some of your greatest challenges and how you responded to them. So Shaniza, if you want to start with that one first, and then we'll move to Deborah.
Sure. I think the greatest challenge was not realizing what I was getting myself into. And I shared that very candidly, because I think it's an important thing that, even when I saw some of the questions that came in from uh, those who are here attending, is that this is likely a bigger process than you realize, because, as you're probably hearing a little bit, um, what I thought would be relatively plug and play. And when I say that, it's because of the trust in OCASI and the alignment with the community that we serve, and the community that OCASI built this, the agencies that they built this strategy for. And while it was very helpful, of course, and the resources were very, very good, what it meant as an organization was that we really needed to start either from the ground up, but like we needed to start basically with our mission, vision, and values. And so, because I had so many new staff, I felt I had to really slow down my strategic planning process and my expectations of when this work would get done. Really, really had to slow it down. And then once I wrapped my head around it, I realized this is going to be another year and a half process. And this is a real organizational transformation opportunity. And I know that sounds, perhaps intimidating, and it was at times. Um, one challenge is, I'd say, you want buy-in, and so it's really important that we started. For us, it was very important for us to start with values, because I mentioned that I have a team that's half, people who've been with us 6 years plus, and then half of those who were very new. And so these values were embodied and were created by the staff who had been here longer. And yet, I don't know if I'd say that younger staff kind of questions, are these really what we do? Like, is this still true? Maybe it was true before for you. Coming back from COVID, things had changed so much and we had grown so much. Um, we needed to sort of check in and refine. So that was an incredible other workshop that we really, really tore things apart and kind of started again. And so it was really great to get the buy-in, I'd say, of everybody, because their input was so valuable. And from there, it was actually taking those values and using them to guide the rest of the work that needs to be done. So I guess, and then also I would say in terms of challenges is, it is so helpful to have that external support, but budget is always going to be an issue, right? And so as we look to continue this work, it is very helpful when you have somebody facilitating the process with you. And then I'd say the third thing, which actually we did get to resolve later, is doing this on your own as a leader of your organization or the person who is leading these efforts. I feel like everybody expects you to know the right the right thing to do, And even if you know where you're trying to go, which I felt like I did, knowing how to get there was challenging for sure. And so not having peers for a good chunk of the time, Deborah and I actually did connect at at an event at one point, and it's so funny. She was speaking about her experience just before I did, and I was like, oh my goodness, it felt like we were going through parallel experiences, and it was the first time that we were able to connect. And that was so helpful from that point on, even just having someone to speak through it and think through it. So I know this, we started with challenges, but that's actually how we sort of really address that. And there may be more to share there, but um, yeah, I think the resources doing this alone and really being expected to know, and because of how important it is to do this work genuinely, to
Mhm.
do this work with care and authentically, and not for it to appear. Unfortunately, I feel like us working in this sector, because we hold so many people accountable and because we believe in our work, we're almost like the what's the word I want to call it? The performative police, and unfortunately, we can even do that to each other sometimes. And so um, really, really was trying to do this as authentically and to include everyone as possible, because there is a fear, I think, as a leader that you're just doing this to check off something that you have to be done, because it is a lot of work, right, to take this on. So yeah, I think those are probably some of the key challenges.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And I know you said you were kind of do, doing it alone and felt like you were doing it alone, but I think a lot of us go through that with anything that we do around anti-race, and we wanted to do it authentically. Deborah, what are your thoughts about the greatest challenges for your organization?
Yes, absolutely echo Shanice's comments there. I feel like, as ED, we're leading this work, but I'm certainly not an expert in this work. And I try to walk humbly through the process. And one thing that really came to the front early on was that it had to be slowed down. Um, and I think we exist in a world of deadlines and pressures and all these things happen, shouting for attention at the same time. But this work has to be intentional. We didn't want to end up with a dormant policy that just sort of laid untouched. Um, and again, to echo Shaniza, the last thing we wanted to do was be performative, and it can be lonely, absolutely. And finding that support, that peer support, is so crucial. Um, I also think a challenge was just finding staff time. Um, Difficult to provide consistent input. We were really working through the policy over summer, and while there's not, ever going to be a great time, that was difficult, just fitting in vacations and just on some practical angles like that. But I think it's up to us as management, to create the time for staff, to block the time for staff, not during a lunch break or additional, you know, loo time or anything like that, but to reiterate the message that this work is important and it does have value and it does have a place in your daily work. I think another challenge for us, because we worked with a small group of staff, was making sure that we had a really robust communication plan to other members of staff. So we have multiple sites as well. So that was an additional challenge. And we really wanted to make sure that everybody felt engaged and included in the process. So we did revisit our implementation plan several times to make sure that we were adding in enough opportunities to share our progress, to invite feedback from the teams. And one thing we had done, which just sort of fell into place the first time, but worked really well, so we would, continue that, is every time there's an opportunity to get staff together for feedback and updates, pair it with some training. So some training on an aspect of the policy or some terminologies within the policy, and that worked well because it sort of embedded the policy in a kind of a practical sense. Um, yeah, and I think those are my additional challenges.
Thank you for mentioning that. And I think it's really important because when we do some of these higher level strategic planning, we often think it's going to be the leadership and the board that's going to be involved, but it's so important to get that ownership from the staff, that because they're the ones that are going to be implementing it, right? So thank you for mentioning some of those challenges. And a lot of organizations that have frontline staff are funded to meet certain targets, right? And then to convince them, in addition to your responsibilities, we're also going to be, tackling this big project, will be challenging in itself. So thank you for sharing how you kind of manage those challenges. In terms of your communities that you work with, what did you hear from the communities? Were there any issues that you had to resolve, or was there, quick uptake from the communities about the process? I know some of you already mentioned the impact that it had on your organizational mission, vision, and values, but if there's anything else you want to add to that. And then in terms of, we talked about staff engagement. Did issues of staff safety, client safety, safety of the leadership come up in your conversations? So I know it's a loaded question, but I can break it down for you if you want, or if you want to tackle pieces of it, that's fine too. Shanice?
Thank you. So I guess for us, just where we were in the process, we were still doing a lot of internal work, as we were, like I said, slowing down our strategic planning process because we added revisiting of our vision, mission, and values. Um, and so I think what we found was that we were seeing interactions sometimes among youth. We have to realize also the backdrop of when we were doing this work is that there was so much conflict happening both at home and abroad. And so I think the importance of some of these policies, especially if we're working with youth, with the way that students are being treated in schools, with sensitivities, I guess, to uh, people people's identities, and speaking out, regardless of what they are. And so with that, we did find that there were some instances among youth, and we actually had some instances with parents dealing with our staff, and a volunteer even. And so some of these interactions really needed to be governed by this updated policy. And so for us, what became apparent is that we wanted to establish we wanted to use the values and then also the sort of the principles of the policy, the area of policy, to create a standard code of conduct that really governs the work of anybody that interacts with the organization, anybody externally. And so we currently have a code of conduct in place for our board members. We have sort of like a service user agreement. And so while there's similar principles, we just felt like they needed to be updated and then ideally just standardized. So whether you're a contractor, whether you're a volunteer, whether you're a young person, whether you are a board member, that these principles apply for everybody. And so that in this way, we can protect our staff when they go out, because so much of our work is out in the community, and that our staff can also feel that they have the right to speak up and that they can flag when they feel that they've maybe been mistreated. Um, and again, because I work with those who are early on in the career, sometimes that doesn't like sometimes staff don't always speak up because they think, well, this is a valuable partner, or this person, so it was very like because they didn't want to maybe rock the boat too much. And so it's really important. And so I felt like the creation of a code of conduct would help to give them that confidence to speak up and to identify, because there's no way for us to address the issue if we don't know, right? And for them to feel confident that their employer is going to protect them, whether they're dealing with clients, volunteers, or partners.
Hmm. Thank you for mentioning that. And I think just based on my own experience too, even if you have a policy in place, until somebody takes the first step in bringing something forward, the staff still are hesitant, right? So I've had that experience where there's been issues, and it's a very safe working environment, but people just don't want to rock the boat and they just want to continue the work. But if somebody speaks up first, then you get that interaction and that kind of rolling as a result of that. Deborah, anything to add to that?
Very similar response to Shaniza in that, a strong policy coming from the organization that aligns with other organizational structures, such as the vision and the mission and HR policies, and provides something for staff to refer back to. So we'll give them that confidence when they're out doing their work, whether it's in the office or externally, that they feel confident that they can respond to incidences outside of day-to-day. We also hope the policy will create respectful and productive dialogue for conversations that happen within our organization and with partners outside of our organization, and provide structure for us to respond to any incidences. For example, we did have a volunteer, and certain behaviors led to that volunteer no longer being employed with us, and the policy really did provide some consistency and some very, very solid understanding of why these things were happening and what would and would not be tolerated in terms of behavior. So as you said, once that policy becomes actionable, then we really start to see it as something that can support and embed the values of the organization throughout our day-to-day actions.
Great, thank you for sharing that. So in terms of, we have a lot of nonprofits here today that are probably looking to at ways to implement this toolkit, this strategy. Do you have any practical advice for them? So it could be around some of the maybe challenges around funding, because this work does require resources, or in terms of like you had a certain expectation. I know both of you mentioned some of that at the beginning, but what would be some practical advice you can pass on to some of the folks here today? Deborah, do you want to start with that?
Sure. So yes, the issue of funding, and as it relates to training and training opportunities, the importance of training became so apparent throughout the whole process, in order to effectively communicate the policy to staff members and have those opportunities to have facilitated discussions around certain ideologies. And they're not easy conversations to have, and we definitely recognize the need for support. And I think as an agency, and when I try and communicate with the board and funders, we have to shift our viewing of this education from a nice to have to an absolutely critical need if we're going to move this work forward. And it's an investment, that will affect our entire organizational culture, staff retention, client well-being. Like the knock-on effect of having this education and this training and increasing staff knowledge is so valuable. The other piece that might seem small, but we found was very impactful as we went through the policy, and we were looking at our vision and HR policies and strat plan, to be really consistent with your language. So align your language throughout all those pieces, all those documents, and make sure that specific words that come up again and again are included in the glossary. We found certain terms and words that weren't included in the glossary, so we made sure that everything was referenced. So new staff coming in who aren't necessarily part of this process will be able to pick up the document, and hopefully be very understandable and accessible. We touched on board engagement, but I feel, engaging your board from the very beginning sort of sets out the expectation as you go forward. It's not going to be a 6-month process or a 12-month process. It is a long-term commitment of your time. And another funding challenge that we identified was translation, need for translation, when the policy is finalized, to make sure that it is accessible in other languages that reflect the staff and community.
Great, thank you for sharing that, Deborah. Shaniza, anything to add in terms of practical advice?
Yes, absolutely. I think the acknowledgement that this can't live on the side of your desk, and without a very concrete plan, which it may take some time for you to wrap your head around and be able to identify what it uniquely looks like for your organization, depending on where you are and what work you had ahead of you. It just so happened that Deborah was in her strategic planning process, and I was just about to begin as we were doing this. So it was really great to be able to incorporate it. That you really need a lead of some sort. Like you do need either consultant support or someone who can help you just even as a project coordinator, just to kind of keep this going, because as leaders, there's so much that is on your plate that will have deadlines that you need to prioritize, but that this work is essential and it's required. Um, I would say that if you can find, if you can develop some sense of community, whether it's in your lips or whether it's a peer organization, even if it's one other ED that you might work together with, or you have a similar organization, you work in the same community. If there is a way to have some sort of community that you can try to go through this process with, or just be able to talk this through, it would be, I wish that would be the thing that I would do differently if I could start again. And then I would also say to take your time, especially at the beginning as you're engaging your team. And then lastly, to really protect and carve out the time. I know that this is something that Deborah said earlier, but I knew in these last couple of months there was so much going on for us that it wasn't, we weren't going to be able to dive into this and give it the time and respect that it needs. So really sort of developing a bit of a plan that there's sort of a monthly session that we are spending and diving deep, and we come prepared knowing that this is what we're going to do and that we're protecting that time for our staff is the way that we're going to move this forward. But that we really haven't been able to do that with all of the other projects that we had in the works. So yeah, I think taking your time to figure out what you need, getting help if you can, and then that it's okay if this work takes some time, and it needs to, so that you can have everyone really come alongside you in the process.
Thank you so much. I'm sure that's very helpful to folks in terms of managing their own expectations. So before we finish, I have two more questions. So in terms of, both of you mentioned this is an ongoing process, it's going to take some time. What are some of the needs that haven't been met yet in terms of your organization's, your ongoing needs that you still feel like you need additional resources for? That's the first question. And then we're just going to finish off in terms of a positive note. So maybe, Shaniza, do you want to start us off with that? And then I'll move to Deborah.
So I think the ongoing needs, I think I sort of alluded to it, was the some sort of a project lead or a project coordinator to keep this work going. I feel like I know the work that needs to be done, that there are a lot of resources out there, but it's the coordination of those in a timely manner, understanding what that will cost, and just keeping the engagement of the team ongoing, collecting results, like, being able to document feedback. So I think that is the first need truly that's been holding me back from being able to go further faster. And then the second, sorry, and then in terms of a positive note, truly it was actually having the chance to share and discuss with another ED, and then to be able to sort of talk through some of the stuck points. Um, and so if that's something even that, yeah, that we find a way to facilitate on a broader scale for other agencies, I think that would alone be actually such an important resource to our fellow organizations here.
In terms of your organization, Shaniza, have you seen an impact already in your organization that you would, sometimes like we need these kind of wins to motivate us to keep going? Have you seen that at your organization at this point?
I do think yes and no. So the taking your time is difficult, but then that's not always what your staff want. Like, sorry, the taking the time is essential, but not always what your staff wants, so that you can do the work well. Um, but I do think that it created an environment where people could speak up and know that they actually, we do hear you, we want to hear you, and we want your input. And like I said, it was more newer staff, because I think those who had been there did have that understanding, but creating that safety to speak up about the expectations for the team, about what they want, from the organization, what they wish to see. And I think that is when you're going to be in your best place, to move wherever it is that you want to take your organization.
Great, thank you for sharing. So Deborah, in terms of the ongoing needs and then a positive aspect for yourself or for your organization or for your staff.
So I think ongoing needs are capacity, keeping the momentum going, and training. really, that's a key piece of this work. I think the positive aspects for us, as I said, we began the process with an organizational assessment. So we'll always have that as a baseline now to kind of refer back to as we go forward, to sort of have that measurement when we redo the assessment in, say, 6 months, a year from now, to see what, if any, progress has been made in the eyes of staff. Excuse me. And I think, as Shaniza said, it's opened up space for conversation, some that were already happening, but some that weren't internally. And I think that that's really important. And I think despite the slow pace, it still has to be, that slow pace is crucial to doing this mindfully and effectively. And I think part of the process as well has been recognizing that we need a lot of resources in the agency that we don't necessarily have. So training resources, and they don't always have to cost money. There's lots online. There's lots available through OCASI or other organizations. So, to allow us to take a bit of time to look through those and amass some kind of, maybe it'll end up being a portal, or if it's a physical book, we'll have an area in our boardroom. So, taking time to think about what resources are needed to continue this work, and for new staff coming in to have something that can be easily accessed. Those are some of the positive aspects.
Great. Thank you so much, Shaniza and Deborah. I do want to bring in Asha to the conversation and have some, I'm sure folks have questions for her as well. So Asha, in terms of designing the toolkit, how did you balance the varying opinions? I'm sure there were quite a lot, and objectives when you were designing the kit that the organizations can use or consider in their journeys.
Yeah, so one thing that was really helpful, OCASI was extremely helpful in facilitating um, gathering ideas and also supporting an advisory to share ideas. One of the things I always say when I go into this work is come with an open mind. I don't know everything. And so that was really helpful in taking opinions and objectives and integrating them into how I shaped or how we formed the policy, the overview, the guide, and what now is comprised as the kit. And the other thing I think was really important in our process was communication and also having an objective, being very clear on what we were trying to achieve. There was a lot of feedback and sharing in the process of if you were offering comments or had questions as to why we were going in one direction. We did have a foundation, and that's rooted in sort of feminist perspectives and knowledge. But we also grounded that in what we were trying to achieve. And so anytime we move forward in one direction, there was a reasoning or provided, or if we omitted something or changed the language around it or integrated it maybe differently than someone had imagined, we also informed them as to why to the best of our ability. So there was a lot of communication, there was a lot of shared drives and follow-ups, and then there was a lot of opportunity for people to ask questions. And I know it comes up that folks feel maybe fatigued by processes of always offering information or being online. But I can't speak for anyone, but what I saw on the other end was a lot of interest and desire and excitement to contribute. And that really did show up in the work. So in terms of the feedback that we got or comments or any questions asked, or even just access to the information that was being gathered across sort of the journey or the assessment or process. So I think it's really finding how to balance both interest, sort of desire, objectives, and then really having an understanding of where we are trying to go and communicating that as effectively as we possibly can.
Thank you for sharing that, Asha. And I imagine it wasn't an easy task, so kudos to you for getting that done. In terms of organizations, what do you think are some of the supports that organizations are looking for when they're looking to work with the anti-racism, anti-oppression work?
Yeah, I think a lot has been shared through Shaniza and Deborah in terms of some external support that is required and then internal buy-in or support. necessary to move the work forward, as well as sort of these what is new here and I love is the sort of generational difference between expectations actually in the workplace experience and the existence of an organization or culture, sort of as it stands in negotiating or working with the two. But what I also heard from today's conversation, and I think is very valuable to the work, is that we have this like there's a desire to do things perfect or to reinvent the wheel, but there's a lot that's being done or that already exists or processes that folks are tapping into that help make the work easier in a sense. And I say this in air quotations, but easier to approach, easier to sort of come to rather than these sort of lofty or abstract ideas or things that maybe seem unachievable, really understanding where we are and putting it into action, as this is titled. So action also means the doing. It doesn't mean that we can that we have all the information at hand, but it's what are we taking, like Shaniza has said, what are we taking from people responding to us and creating documents that support our work? How are we being mobilizers of knowledge through those efforts? How at the same time are we creating, maybe doing internal shifts or transformative shifts, and then at the same time responding to what's happening in real time for people. And I think the simultaneous effort is a form of actionable support that's really happening on the ground. And so those are also as informative as coming to a session. Those are also as informative as seeking information from other organizations. And it also helps with the applying of ARAO in your context. And I think those are things that we can lean into and we can lean on because people are always giving us information. The question is, how do we use it? And so it might be looking for, like I said, external support. It might be utilizing the support that you have in the organization. It might be coming to revisiting what exists in the organization. So maybe these current policies and sitting with those for a while.
Mhm.
Um, and then just tapping into what people are saying, what information people are giving you in sort of informal settings or formats.
Thank you for sharing that, Asha. So we've learned quite a lot today from all three of you. So Asha, if you were to give an advice to the organizations in terms of their first step today, so after this webinar, what advice would you give them to, as in, what should they do next?
Depending on where the organization is, I think it does vary. What I would say, I think, is the easiest thing to do if we can if you don't have a sort of a role or if you have time, set a day or two aside or a few hours in the day and assess current policies for consistencies or inconsistencies to support an assessment, maybe in the future, or if you're currently going through an assessment to support that and really determine where the organization is, what can be done, and where we want it to go. And that can be done with a team. Maybe you do something where you're synthesizing information, shared information across the documents, or it can be independently and you provide sort of like a briefing to folks. But really setting the time aside to say that we are committed while we're not maybe where we want to be or we don't have the resources yet, we are setting a foundation to create the environment for which AROAO, our journey can begin or move forward.
Amazing. That's really great advice because we know that for a lot of our organizations, even though, our intentions are in the right place, our policies are really outdated. Like sometimes they're decades old, right? And we just can't find the time to invest in them. And I think that's really great advice. Like even a couple of hours a week, just look at the different policies and scan them to see where you are at. Thank you so much, Shaniza, Deborah, and Asha. We do have some time for audience Q&A, so you're free to use the chat box, sorry, the Q&A box that's at the bottom of your screen. So if folks have any questions that are directed to a specific panelist or a speaker, you can mention that in the Q&A as well. Then I can redirect that towards the speaker, or if you have general questions for our set of panelists here, you can put that on as well, and we'll go through those questions. So feel free to enter any questions. I know it takes a couple of minutes for people to to process. There's been a lot of information. So while that's happening, we did have some questions that the audience, the attendees, sent to OCASI staff in advance of the webinar. I'll start with the first question, and maybe I'll pose this to Shaniza because she mentioned some of the what's happening around the world impacting their clients and their staff. So the first question from an attendee is, what are some practical ways to incorporate anti-racism, anti-oppression framework in times where people are witnessing current genocides?
That's a really good question. I really have struggled with this, to be very open. Um, I don't know if I have the answer to this. It has been extremely difficult. Um, it has been a lot more one-on-one conversations rather than organizational. Um, this is a very good question. I'm sorry, I actually don't know. It has been very, very difficult to know how to navigate this well. I think making room to have individual staff who may be impacted or who want to look for a way to support. I don't think that we're using the framework necessarily in this process, but I will share that I did have a number of staff share or demonstrate interest to support, um, whether there were those who were brought to Canada under whatever umbrella, but to be able to provide practical support to feel less helpless and to find opportunities to do the work that we do in support of those who may need it. And so I think that that is probably, at least for us, it felt like the safest way, because it hasn't felt very safe to really engage in um, a lot of conversations about this. We are also quite a diverse team, and so um, yeah, so I would say that at least what I've been keeping my eye out for, or where are the opportunities for us to support, whether it's like survivors or those who've been brought to Canada. And for example, if it might be with employment, because we have employment caseworkers, whether it's their settlement needs or more so even just with education and etc. Maybe finding your space and where you fit might be the best way forward. Sorry, I wish I had more to offer here, but I don't.
Thank you, Shaniza. And I know a lot of us are struggling with that, right? So it's not an easy question to answer. So I appreciate you taking a stab at it. I attended an event a couple of weeks ago through Amnesty International, and a lot of folks were talking about that, the kind of the hopelessness, the anger around the room. But I think just getting motivation from the fact that people that have been in the sector for decades and decades have gone
Mhm.
through these kind of world events and
Mhm.
oppressions. And so they said, we got through it. And so we
Mhm.
can't despair. We need to continue to act, and we need to continue to, collectively do whatever we can, right? So thank you for sharing that. While we wait for folks to again process what they've learned and post questions in the Q&A, I'm going to pose another question that folks sent in before the webinar. It is, how can anti-racism initiatives in the settlement sector address the overlapping oppressions of diverse individuals? Anybody want to take a stab at that one?
I can share something here only because we experience this a lot
Go ahead.
with the youth that we serve, and so um, so the I felt like the only way that this is what also the the slowing down helped to do is, as a team, we identified the identities of youth that we felt that we weren't serving to the degree that we wanted to. And it was good to know that more youth felt safe and comfortable to share and to seek our services, and that our staff felt comfortable to say, hey, look, I think that we need, as an organization, we need to for example, understand how to support neurodiverse youth to a greater extent. And I heard that this was more of a, from our local school trustee, that this is actually an ongoing concern that he hears from parents and educators. There are multiple other examples. And so I felt a bit overwhelmed about how to take this policy and apply it to all of these groups, because we had identified about 5 groups that we wanted to start with, not to say that that was completely conclusive. And so I will share, and I'm sure that there will be more information about this in the coming months, but what I found is I through this project, I was able to be exposed to the GBA plus process and tools. And I will say that they kind of give you a very structured way and tools about how to approach this. And it helped me to see that what we should do is really tackle one area at a time, understanding that then those clients of yours that have multiple, intersecting identities, that you can do justice, I think, to them, rather than thinking about specific situations and how might you serve this one person. And so, for example, we started with a lot of the training through OCASI about Positive Spaces Initiative. And as a follow-up to the training, though, is like, what did we learn? What did we take away? But also, how can we create a bit of an audit for our programs, right? And so we ensure we're consistent across the board, and that it is almost like a filter that we pass our spaces, our programs, our services, even our communications through this filter, or through these various checks, I guess. And so the intention for us is to kind of take take one area at a time, which we want to intentionally develop, and sort of go through this very thorough process, and then go to the next, and then go to the next, and then go to the next. And so rather than trying to tackle them all at the same time, and that what we hope to produce is sort of a really healthy ARAO audit, I guess, for our programs and services and our spaces. And that's something that we can continue to develop and add on to. That's the
Great.
approach that we're taking. Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing, Shaniza. Asha, anything to add to that?
Yeah, and I can add here, and I think it goes back to the first question. I like to say that or to offer to think of ARAO as an invitation, as an effort for humanity and its universality in terms of its application and understanding. And so while at times we may find, and there will always be competing interests, grounding our work and education in ARAO is essential and critical to organizations. And as I mentioned earlier, knowledge mobilizers. In different ways, we are sharing information, we are changing information. Our language lands and is very important in terms of how people come to understand, interact with us. And I think it's a framework and a lens that we can return to that really aids in confronting racism and oppression. That again hinders people's full right to humanity, both globally and locally. And one of the things I like to center my work and my research in Black feminist thought, and I think when we ground ourselves in these work and principles, one of them being of care, we really understand that care is multidimensional and it's multi-pronged. And so care, like at the core of it all, I would say and offer here, is one of those things that allows us to see and imagine a future and a current times differently. And so, as Shaniza has mentioned, when we look at these overlapping layers of folks, even if we pay attention to say one or address one concern at one time, I think it allows or supports how we see ourselves and our existence as part of humanity, and reframing how we come to either contribute or expect or understand ARAO sort of globally, or as like sort of a global approach or framework or universal. So I always say, like, invite yourself into the conversation about, and even me, I challenge myself daily with when competing interests come up, when my interests I feel are at my forefront, and that's, we always, in some ways, we can defer to thinking about ourselves depending on how we center ourselves, and some of the burden and expectation then falls on certain communities to support those efforts. So how do we place ourselves in that conversation? And then in looking at that, how do we center the foundations or the roots of certain frameworks or objectives that we look at? to approach this work, to understand our place in this work, and understand that the work takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of time. It takes effort inside the organization and outside the organization. And so how do we marry those two through the knowledge, through our continued efforts, and also through how we show up in the work? That's what I would add. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that, Asha. So we do have a question in the Q&A here. So maybe I'll ask Deborah this first, and then other folks are free to add. How did or would you navigate if you have staff that have very strong opinions on kind of divergent ends? For example, if there are certain expectations of staff that somebody needs to be fired for a comment that was made that was inappropriate, so how would you balance that with your HR policies and the process? Deborah, do you want to start with that one first?
Sure, I can try. I think something that the ARO policy does is set a groundwork for open dialogue, progressive dialogue. It helps people feel confident in bringing situations to management. And the fact, as we've talked about throughout the session, if you embed those values into your vision and your strategic plan, you make it part of your orientation process. Hopefully it will give you some kind of framework to respond to those kind of views. It's not going to be perfect, but hopefully being upfront with expectations, what the steps are in terms of disciplinary action, and what is written in your HR policies, those will be referred to in the ARAO policy as well. So having that consistency throughout the organization will help to respond. And hopefully provide everybody involved with a sense that, if not a resolution, a sense that, you know, their voice is heard and important and valued. So I don't know if that helps, but in looking at the ARO framework and the policy, it might help, you know, center that discussion, give something to center that discussion around.
Thank you, Deborah. Shaniza, anything to add to that?
Yeah, just quickly, I think something that I actually left out is we did have a situation that was actually a bit similar. And so I think, one, it's important to demonstrate that you take concerns like this seriously. And so in that instance, we actually chose to have a workplace investigation. And the results were that this wasn't harassment or discrimination. But what I felt was important about that process is that it's actually caused us to revamp sort of our complaint or incident reporting process. And what I realized what was needed is that sometimes people will go to an extreme. And the reason that they will, sorry, an extreme action, not saying it's justified or not, because they don't know their options. They don't know what are the steps that are there in between. And I think as organizations and leaders, it's important for us to build in conciliatory processes or opportunities for mediation. And it made it apparent to me that we didn't necessarily have some of those in previous times. If there was ever a misunderstanding, we had a safety interest to just be able to have a conversation. This is a relatively new staff, and so I think in not having that, and this is where the policy is not being updated, right, for new people, you're not sure how you're being protected. So I think it's really important to me, when I reflected on the situation, I realized that that was actually what was going on. This could have been resolved in a different way, but we hadn't created a very clear, what I would say, complement to the policy, which is here's sort of a series of an escalation process, if you will, right? This would be the first attempt of what would happen. And I would really encourage organizations to connect with and understand where you could involve a mediator, so that you try internally, you then try to involve somebody externally, because the costs of doing something like an investigation are very, very restrictive and not always in everybody's reach. So you do want to build in some resources, but sometimes you do need external support and help. And so I think that would be my suggestions, that the policy needs to have very concrete methods. Restorative justice is something that we use in our programs and is really important with young people, and I think has a role even within organizations as a way for us to learn and grow, because doing the work that we do you know, we don't want to be furthering cancel culture, right? Like we want, because that's essentially sometimes what this is. And we want to create room for dialogue and learning and repair. And so I think our policies and our practices need to reinforce that.
Thank you, Shanisa. Asha, anything to add to that question?
Sorry. No, I don't. How would you navigate on both ends? Yeah, actually I do. I do think it's really important to have these conversations, and they do open up dialogue. As others have said, I think it's really important to ground our work in the policies so that we can come back or point back to something. Um, and I think even around navigating or gauging staff expectations, it's also having organizational, I guess, practices or processes for dealing with instances like this, and figuring out the best way to mediate these challenges. I know for some folks, restorative practices aren't necessarily the way they go, but for others it works. And so I think it's a matter of having those hard conversations, the difficult conversations that do come up as part of this work, and referring back to something. Like I said, I always say information really is power. And so people will not understand, but hopefully have something to fall back on to, or know or educate themselves around the ways in which these difficult conversations can actually move us forward. And actually something I came to on the weekend with someone is around conflict or confrontation, and something that we move away from. But I would say three C's: confrontation is conversation is confirmation. And the confirmation is how you can move forward, what needs to happen next as you move forward, and what can we learn from the situation.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And I know there's probably many other questions and a lot of kind of thoughts popping up, but that's all the time that we have today for the webinar. I'm going to repost in the chat the link for the toolkit for those that are interested in exploring for their own organization. So, and I am sure that you have colleagues here that have already tried to implement the toolkit that could be available to you for, as Shaniza mentioned, that was very helpful to her when she was implementing it for her own organization, to just kind of have a soundboard to bounce ideas off and have people that are on the same page as you and in the same process of implementation. So I think we've got a really great group of supportive folks that are serving the immigrant and refugee sector that could help you through this journey. So there is a post-webinar survey that will be sent to attendees after this webinar via email. So if you could please fill that out, because it does help OCASI figure out what went well today, what they could improve on for the following webinars in this series. As I mentioned, there are 5 more that OCASI has planned. The next one will be in mid-January. So we hope that you learned quite a lot today. Take some time to process it. And then I'm sure OCASI is available if folks want to reach out or have further questions or advice on how to implement the toolkit for your own organizations. Thank you so much for joining us today, and hopefully we'll see you at the next one in January. And thank you, Shaniza, Deborah, and Asha, for your amazing contributions, our amazing ASL interpreters, and our French interpreter as well.